In the heart of Savannah, where cobblestones glow in the fading light, a powerful man was about to face a truth he never expected. Ethan Marshall, a millionaire CEO who thought he had everything, stopped when he saw a little girl mocked for her torn dress. She wasn't crying, but the quiet strength in her eyes cut deeper than any insult could. When she told him her name, Sophie Grant, his world shifted. That single word Grant unraveled years of buried memories, love once lost, and a life he had abandoned for ambition. What he discovered next would not only break his heart, but force him to question what truly matters. This isn't just a story about wealth or success. It's about redemption, second chances, and the healing power of love. Stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe to Loss and Healing for more stories that will move your soul. Savannah in late afternoon had a kind of glow that made the old stones look alive, as though every corner of the city was holding on to centuries of memory. To Ethan Marshall, the wealthy CEO who owned half the hotels lining the riverfront, it had usually been nothing more than scenery on his way to meetings, deals, and dinners. He had walked across these same squares 100 times, with the brisk steps of a man convinced he was too important to notice details. But on that day, his carefully built rhythm faltered. He had just stepped out of the riverfront hotel, the jewel of his empire, after hours of tense debate with investors who cared more about numbers than people. His head still buzzed with arguments about profit margins and expansions, and he was rehearsing his next line of defense when something pierced through the fog of business. It wasn't a siren or a car horn, it was laughter, sharp, cruel, and too loud against the gentle splash of the nearby fountain. Almost without meaning to, Ethan turned his head. A cluster of children stood in a half-circle, their faces lit with the unmistakable expression of superiority that comes from ganging up on someone weaker. And there in the center was a little girl. She was no older than 6, her small shoulders drawn tight as if to shield herself from the jeers. Her dress, once floral, was frayed at the edges, thin enough that the fading sunlight seemed to shine right through. In her arms, she clutched a canvas bag like a shield. Something inside Ethan tightened. He had seen plenty of men fight dirty in boardrooms, but this cruelty, directed at a child, felt sharper than any contract betrayal. He crossed the square, his leather shoes dull against the stones. The children scattered, their giggles trailing off, but the girl remained frozen, staring at his polished shoes rather than his face. "Hey there," he said softly, crouching so he wouldn't tower over her. His own voice surprised him. It was gentler than the tone he used in business, almost careful. The girl finally looked up, her wide blue eyes steady despite the flush on her cheeks. "Rough day?" he asked. "I'm fine," she murmured, the words sounding far too practiced for a child. Then she added, "They just laugh because my dress isn't new." Her voice carried no self-pity, only a matter-of-fact steadiness that twisted something deep inside him. Ethan noticed the corner of a drawing poking out from the bag she clutched. With cautious curiosity, he asked, "What's in the bag?" She hesitated, then pulled out a hand-drawn postcard of the cathedral across the square. The lines were uneven, the colors bright and determined. "Did you make this?" he asked. She nodded. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's talent," he said, taking the card in his hands. "What's your name?" Another pause, as though names were something valuable to protect. Finally, she whispered, "Sophie. Sophie Grant." The surname hit him like a physical blow. Grant. The sound crashed through his thoughts, scattering the present moment. His chest tightened as a memory surged forward. Claire Grant. Her defiant smile, the way she tilted her head when she challenged him.
Nana says you have to be
The night everything between them fell apart. He forced himself to breathe evenly, to focus on the girl in front of him rather than the storm inside his chest. "That's a beautiful name," he said, though his voice sounded far away even to himself. Sophie's hand tightened around the toe, and then, with a bravery that felt older than her years, she asked, "Do you want to see another one?" She pulled out a card of Forsyth Park's gates, drawn with bold strokes of crayon. Ethan studied it, struck by the effort in each line. She explained, "I sell them for $1 sometimes." He had signed contracts worth millions with a flick of a pen, built resorts that charged thousands per night. And here was a little girl selling her art for a single $1. He fumbled for his wallet and handed her a $5 bill. "This is worth more than one," he said. Her brows furrowed, and she shook her head. "Nana says you have to be fair." The word barely registered over the echo of her surname, Grant. Every time it sounded in his head, it rang like a bell pulling up memories he had tried to bury. He pressed the bill into her hand anyway. "Call it a tip," he said with a small smile. Her hand brushed against his as she took it, and for a fleeting moment, the years collapsed. He saw Claire's eyes in this child, the same piercing blue, the same quiet fire. Something shifted in him, an unease that was both painful and irresistible. As he straightened to leave, Sophie managed a quick smile. "You too, mister," she said when he told her to take care of herself. And then she turned back toward her drawings, as though the world had already moved on. But Ethan couldn't. His steps back to the waiting car were slower than usual. Behind him, the square returned to its rhythm footsteps, voices, the splash of water. Yet inside his head, a single name echoed louder than everything else. Grant. By the time his driver opened the door, Ethan knew something had shifted irrevocably. The girl wasn't just another child in the square. She was a living fragment of a past he had tried to lock away. And whatever this was, it was not going to leave him in peace. The penthouse apartment usually felt like a sanctuary, perched high above the city with glass walls framing the sparkling lights of Savannah. For years, Ethan had treated this view like a balm. After endless boardroom battles, after shaking hands on multi-million-dollar contracts, he would pour a drink, look down at the river, and convince himself he was untouchable. But tonight, the glittering skyline mocked him. Every light seemed to demand a question he could not answer. He loosened his tie, yet the tightness in his chest did not ease. The silence of the apartment felt cavernous, swallowing every sound until it was just him and the steady echo of one name, Grant. He moved almost on instinct toward the hall closet, climbing on his toes to reach a plain cardboard box buried on the top shelf. Dust coated the lid, and when he opened it, the faint scent of cedar drifted into the air. Inside lay the fragments of a life he had once lived, with reckless hope photographs, trinkets, scraps of memory he had forced himself to hide. He lifted out a faded ticket stub from a summer concert in Charleston, a shell picked up on Tybee Island, a napkin with a silly doodle Claire had sketched while waiting for dessert. Each object carried a weight that pulled at him, unraveling years of carefully constructed detachment. At the bottom, beneath everything else, were photographs. He picked one up, his thumb brushing across Claire's face. In the picture, she was laughing, her dark hair loose, her eyes bright with mischief. He could hear her voice even now, teasing him for being too serious, telling him to live, to love, to risk. For a moment, he let himself sink back into that day. The picnic under the magnolias, the way the air smelled of summer rain, the warmth of her hand in his. And then, just as quickly, he remembered how it ended, how ambition whispered louder than love, how he let her walk away. He set the photograph down with trembling hands. The timeline pressed against his mind like an accusation.
Really
7 years since he had last seen her. The little girl in the square, 6 years old. The math was precise, too precise to ignore. His heart raced. Could Claire have been pregnant when she left? Had she carried their child into a world without him? The thought was unbearable. He tried to pour himself a glass of whiskey, but the burn only deepened his unease.
Advance order.
He paced the length of the room, stopping every few steps to glance at the photo, as if the image itself might give him the answer. Sleep never came that night. By morning, his decision had crystallized. Though he didn't speak it aloud, he had to see the girl again. He needed proof, not from a document or a lawyer, but from his own eyes. That afternoon, he cut his meeting short, walking through the familiar square where the fountain sparkled in the midday sun. And there she was. Sophie sat cross-legged on the cobblestones, her tote bag open beside her. Neatly laid out in front of her were rows of postcards, each a miniature version of Savannah's landmarks. She lifted one toward a passerby, smiling hopefully, only to watch them shake their head and keep walking. Ethan's steps slowed as he approached. "Business slow today?" he asked gently. Sophie looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she offered a small grin. Some people buy one, some just say they don't have cash. He crouched beside her, studying the drawings. Each one was full of color and heart, imperfect but alive. "You've got an eye for detail," he said, and he meant it. She shrugged. "Nana says money can't buy back what's lost, but it can fix what's broken." She said it so matter-of-factly that it cut him deeper than any accusation. What kind of life had taught a child to speak with such wisdom? He picked up a postcard of the cathedral. How much? $1, she answered automatically. He pulled a 10 from his wallet and handed it to her. Call it an advance order. Her brow furrowed. That's too much. Consider it my investment in a future famous artist, he replied, trying to keep his voice light. She tucked the bill into her pouch, still unconvinced. You don't have to do that. I know, he said softly, and for the first time he truly did. They sat for a moment in comfortable silence, the hum of the square filling the gaps. Then, almost too casually, he asked, "What was your mom's name?" Sophie's eyes lifted to his, blue and clear as water. "Claire," she said simply. The word struck him like a physical blow. He felt the air thin, the noise of the square growing distant.
I met your granddaughter
He
downtown.
forced himself to nod as though the name hadn't just confirmed every suspicion that had kept him awake through the night. He remembered the rumor show Claire had left Savannah, how someone mentioned Charleston, maybe Florida. He had told himself she was gone forever. Now the truth sat in front of him, clutching a coin pouch, selling hand-drawn postcards to strangers. He wanted to ask everything at once where Claire had been, why she had never told him, what had happened to her, but the questions choked in his throat. Instead, he stood slowly, the words pressing heavy on his chest. "Keep drawing," he said softly. "You've got talent." As he walked away, her words about fixing what's broken echoed in his mind. For years, he had thought his empire made him whole. Now, with every step, he realized it had only built higher walls around the emptiness. And those walls had just cracked. The farther Ethan drove from the polished waterfront, the more the city seemed to shift. The cobblestones gave way to cracked asphalt. The restaurants and boutiques faded into corner stores and sagging porches. His sleek black sedan looked out of place among battered trucks and rusted compact cars. Yet he felt an undeniable pull forward, as though the answer he had been chasing was waiting at the end of the road. He slowed as he reached a weathered clapboard house, its siding once white but now dulled to gray. The porch boards bowed from age. A rocking chair swayed slightly in the breeze. Pots of flowers lined the railing, struggling to bloom but cared for all the same. It was the kind of home that carried the weight of years tired but loved. Ethan climbed the steps and knocked. The sound of his knuckles on the wood echoed too loudly in his ears. A moment later, the door cracked open, revealing a woman in her late 60s. Her silver hair was pinned back in a bun, her sharp hazel eyes steady with cautious appraisal. "Yes?" she asked, her voice polite but edged. "Mrs. Grant?" he began, his throat tight. "My name is Ethan Marshall. I met your granddaughter Sophie downtown the other day. She sold me one of her drawings." Her gaze narrowed, though she opened the door an inch wider. "Did she?" she said evenly. "Yes," Ethan replied, holding her eyes. "She's very talented. I just wanted you to know." The woman studied him, and then without warning, her words cut straight through his composure. "Claire spent her life waiting for you to come back. And now you show up on my doorstep. What do you really want?" The accusation hit harder than any boardroom challenge he had ever faced. He wanted to defend himself, to insist he hadn't known, that he hadn't been given the choice. But excuses felt meaningless under her steady gaze. "I didn't come to cause trouble," he said quietly. "I met Sophie by chance. She reminded me of someone I used to know, that's all." "That someone," she said flatly, "was my daughter." The words hollowed him out. Claire,
that's just a
confirmation of what he had
funny thing I heard
already
from
suspected,
someone else,
yet hearing it spoken
then she says,
aloud left him shaken. "She's gone now," the woman continued. "And I'll be damned if I let anyone disrupt what little stability Sophie has left." Ethan swallowed hard, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I understand. May I at least come in for a few minutes?" Just to talk. For a moment, he thought she would refuse. But with a reluctant sigh, she stepped aside. The living room smelled faintly of chamomile tea and old books. The furniture was worn but neat, carefully arranged. On the walls hung photographs Sophie at different ages, sometimes with her grandmother, sometimes alone. In each picture, she smiled in that careful way children smile when they're trying to be brave. One frame stopped him cold.
I'm glad we are here together.
It was Claire, younger than he remembered, her hair loose around her shoulders, cradling a newborn in a pale blanket. Her smile was radiant, though her eyes carried a depth that pierced him. "That was taken the day Sophie came home from the hospital," the older woman said, her tone softer now. "Claire raised her from that moment on. She never spoke much about you except to say she hoped you were doing well." Ethan's breath caught. "I didn't know," he murmured. The woman's eyes sharpened again. You didn't ask either.
Can't sell
The
anything.
truth stung, but he didn't argue. He sat in the armchair she motioned toward, listening as she recounted the years after Claire left Savannah. How Claire had gotten sick suddenly and passed away when Sophie was only 3. How Sophie had adjusted to life in this old house, how they got by but just barely. Sophie doesn't need pity, Margaret said firmly.
She needs people who will show up and stay. If you can't be that, then it's better you keep walking. Ethan nodded slowly. For once, he had no rehearsed speech, no clever rebuttal.
Only the raw truth. I'm not here to hurt her, he said, and for the first time he felt the words anchor deep inside him. From the back of the house came a burst of laughter, Sophie's laugh, light and unguarded. It filled the air like sunlight breaking through clouds. Ethan felt something inside him shift, a place long dormant stirring back to life. When he finally rose to leave, Margaret walked him to the door. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes lingered on him, measuring. As he stepped back onto the porch, he glanced one last time inside. The photograph of Claire holding the newborn seemed to watch him, the child's tiny features already bearing a resemblance he could no longer deny. By the time he reached his car, Ethan knew his life had taken a turn. Whatever Margaret believed about his motives, whatever doubts she held, one truth had settled firmly in his heart. This wasn't over. The square had a rhythm of its own, one that shifted with the time of day. In the afternoons, tourists gathered near the fountain, children chased pigeons, and the scent of roasted pecans drifted from a vendor's cart. For Ethan, the square had become more than a landmark. It had become the place where his carefully ordered life began to unravel and reshape itself. At first, he lingered on the edges, careful not to intrude. He would make a brief remark about the weather, ask Sophie what she was drawing, and then drift away before the silence grew heavy. But day by day, something changed. Sophie began to offer small pieces of herself. A laugh when he teased her about a crooked line in one of her sketches, a story about how she mixed colors to find the perfect shade for the river, a quiet hum as she packed her postcards at dusk. Soon, Ethan found himself adjusting his schedule around hers. Meetings ended earlier, phone calls were postponed, and by late afternoon, he was crossing the square again. He told himself it was coincidence, habit, a passing interest. But he knew the truth being near Sophie had become as necessary as breathing. One Wednesday, the sky darkened suddenly, and rain swept across the square in heavy sheets. Tourists scattered beneath awnings, and shopkeepers pulled their doors shut. Ethan spotted Sophie huddled beneath the narrow overhang of a closed cafe, clutching her tote bag like a shield. Her braid was damp, strands of hair plastered to her cheeks, but her chin lifted with quiet defiance. "You're going to get soaked," he said, stepping beneath the overhang beside her. She shrugged. "Can't sell anything if I hide at home." That simple sentence lodged in him. He glanced down and noticed her shoes for the first time. Thin canvas, frayed along the sides, the soles curling upward. Through the damp fabric, her small toes peeked out, pale from the cold. The sight jolted him. Memories of Claire came unbidden her bare feet on Tybee Island, laughing as she ran across the sand without caring about the shells that cut. But Sophie's bare toes were different. They weren't about freedom, they were about necessity. "Come with me," he said firmly. Her eyes narrowed. "Where?" "You'll see." He led her across the square through the downpour to a small shoe shop tucked between a bakery and a bookshop. The bell above the door jingled as they entered, releasing the smell of new leather and rubber. Sophie hesitated, gripping her tote like a lifeline. "You don't have to," she whispered. "This isn't about have to," Ethan replied gently. "You're going to have so many adventures, Sophie. You need good shoes for them." The words slipped out before he could stop them. For a moment, she studied his face as if weighing whether to trust him. Then, with quiet acceptance, she let him guide her to a seat. Together, they picked out a pair of sturdy navy sneakers. When she tried them on, she tugged at the laces as though she expected them to snap. But when she stood and shifted her weight from one foot to the other, a small spark of joy flickered across her expression. "Better?" he asked softly. She didn't answer right away. Then, almost too quietly, she whispered, "Yeah." The walk back to her house was slow, the rain easing into mist. Margaret waited on the porch, a dish towel in her hands. Her eyes went straight to the new shoes, then lifted to Ethan's face. "New shoes," she said flatly. "She needed them," Ethan replied, forcing his tone to remain light. Margaret's expression didn't change. Don't get her hopes up if you're not staying." The words hung heavier than the clouds overhead. Sophie slipped inside, leaving Ethan alone with Margaret's steady gaze. "I hear you," he said quietly. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod before turning away. Ethan remained on the porch for a moment longer, inhaling the scent of rain and wet earth before heading back down the steps. The image of Sophie's worn-out shoes stayed with him, as did the unspoken warning etched in Margaret's words. Days passed, and the rhythm between Ethan and Sophie deepened. Some afternoons they sketched together on a bench, trading papers and laughing at each other's crooked lines. Other days they walked in companionable silence, Sophie pointing out details he had long stopped noticing: the tilt of a lamppost, the way sunlight caught the fountain at dusk. One afternoon, Sophie handed him a drawing without a word. It was simple 3 stick figures in front of a lopsided house. One had gray hair and a bun labeled Nana. The second was smaller, a braid trailing down her back labeled Me. The third was taller, with a tie and a smile too big for the crude lines. Beneath him, in careful block letters, were 2 words: My Dad. Ethan stared at it, his throat tightening. The noise of the square faded, leaving only the weight of the paper in his hands and the unspoken hope it carried. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck in his chest. Instead, he folded the drawing gently and slipped it into his coat pocket, the pocket where he kept the things he could not afford to lose. That night, he pulled the drawing out again, studying the uneven lines under the glow of his lamp. It was more than a picture. It was a question, a plea, maybe even a promise. And for the first time, Ethan let himself imagine an answer he had never dared to consider before. The call came just past noon, slicing through the quiet hum of Ethan's office like a blade. Margaret's voice was tight, stripped of all formality. "It's Sophie," she said. "She collapsed at school. They're taking her to Memorial Health." For a moment, Ethan couldn't move. Then, everything blurred into motion. One second, he was gripping the phone. The next, he was in the elevator, his tie loosened, his knuckles white around the steering wheel. Every red light felt like an enemy. Every car in his way was an obstacle, keeping him from the only thing that mattered. When he burst through the glass doors of the hospital, the sterile scent of antiseptic hit him first. Margaret was in the waiting room, her hands clutched around her purse strap so tightly that her knuckles gleamed. Her eyes lifted to him not with suspicion this time, but with raw fear. "They're running tests," she said quickly. The nurse said she just went down right in the middle of art class. Before Ethan could ask more, a doctor appeared, clipboard in hand, his voice professional but edged with urgency. "She's stable for now," he explained. "But we found the cause. Sophie has a congenital heart defect. It's something she was likely born with, but until now, her body compensated for it." Ethan's chest tightened as the doctor continued. "The defect has worsened. The fainting spell was her body's warning. She needs surgery, and soon. The sooner we act, the better her chances for recovery." Margaret's trembling hand reached for Ethan's arm. "Do what you have to," she told the doctor. He nodded and disappeared down the hall, leaving them in silence broken only by the faint hiss of the air conditioning. Ethan began pacing, his footsteps echoing against the linoleum floor. Images of Sophie filled his mind. Her bent over her sketches, the way she grinned when her sneakers fit just right, the hopeful scrawl of "My Dad" on that drawing she had given him. He had thought business meetings were high stakes. This was something else. This was life. Margaret's gaze followed him. She didn't say anything until his pacing grew frantic. Then, with a voice steadier than her shaking hands, she said, "All those years, Claire hoped you would come back. And now you're here. Maybe this is your chance to prove you mean to stay." Ethan stopped, swallowed hard. His voice cracked as he confessed, "All those years I thought I was building something: resorts, deals, an empire. But I was building a monument to emptiness. I thought if I just kept moving, I wouldn't have to face what I'd lost." Margaret's hand reached for his, her grip surprisingly firm. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. Hours passed like years. Nurses moved quietly. The rain outside tapped against the tall windows, the world shrinking to the rhythm of hospital machines. Ethan couldn't sit. He stood in the corridor, his pulse thrumming like a drum. Finally, the surgeon appeared. Cap in hand, mask pulled down, his expression calm. Ethan froze. Every muscle braced for the words he dreaded. But the doctor's voice was steady, even faintly relieved. The surgery went well. She's resting now. She asked for you." The words landed like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Ethan didn't remember moving. One moment he stood in the hall, the next he was running, heart pounding, until he reached the recovery room. Sophie lay in the hospital bed, her small frame dwarfed by white sheets. Tubes and monitors surrounded her, but her face looked peaceful. Her eyelids fluttered open as though she had been waiting for him. "You stayed," she whispered faintly. "Of course I stayed," he replied, and he meant it with a conviction that startled even him. Margaret slipped quietly into the room, a paper cup of coffee in her hand. She looked older, the strain etched into her face. "The nurse says she's stronger than expected," she said softly. Relief washed over Ethan, but it was quickly followed by a heavier truth. He had almost lost her. The thought was unbearable. That evening, after Sophie drifted back to sleep, Margaret motioned for him to follow her into the hallway. In her hands was a small box, worn with time. "Claire left this with me," she said, her voice low. "I told myself I'd give it to Sophie when she was older, but maybe it's time you see it too." Ethan opened the lid carefully. Inside were letters tied with a faded ribbon. The top one bore Claire's handwriting. He unfolded it, and her voice seemed to spill into the room through every line. "If you're reading this, it means I couldn't tell you myself. Maybe you've moved on. Maybe you've forgotten me. I hope not. But either way, I want you to know she's the best thing I ever made. If you find her, love her the way I know you can. Don't let pride or fear keep you from what matters." By the time he finished, Ethan's vision blurred. Margaret's eyes shone too. "She never stopped hoping," Margaret said quietly. "Even when she thought you'd never come back, she believed you could love Sophie if you ever found her."
I understand.
Ethan folded the letter gently, his chest aching with both grief and determination. For years, he had measured success in profits and property lines. Now he understood the weight of what Claire had left behind, a hope entrusted to him. When Sophie stirred again, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "Will you still visit when I'm better?" Ethan leaned close so she could see the truth in his eyes. "I'm not leaving Sophie, ever." Margaret's gaze lingered on him, steady and unyielding. "Words are easy, Mr. Marshall. If you want to be in her life, you'll have to prove it. Not just sentiment, responsibility. Hospital bills, school, the future. Until then, you're here as a friend. Understood?" Ethan met her gaze without flinching. Understood. Sophie's small fingers curled around his hand, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt something steady inside him. Not a deal, not a contract, but a vow. Spring arrived in Savannah with a gentleness that seemed intentional, as if the city itself was giving Sophie time to heal. Azaleas bloomed in bursts of pink and white, and the square, where Ethan had first seen her small, fragile, clutching her totowas, now alive with music, laughter, and the scent of roasting peanuts drifting on the breeze. Months had passed since the surgery. Sophie was no longer pale and faint, but bright with energy, her cheeks flushed with health. Ethan stood at the edge of the square, watching her pedal a bike in careful circles, the sunlight catching her hair. Each loop she made across the cobblestones felt like a victory, each laugh a promise that she was still here. On a bench nearby, Margaret sat knitting, her sharp eyes still protective but softer now. From time to time, she gave Ethan a nod approval, maybe, or at least acknowledgement. He no longer felt like an intruder. He was becoming part of the rhythm. Ethan had stepped back from his empire. The board meetings, the endless phone calls, the constant drive for expansional delegated to others. His calendar now belonged to Sophie's art shows, her school projects, the occasional Saturday trip to the beach. He had once thought success meant never slowing down. Now he understood success was having the time to sit beside a little girl with crayons and watch her imagination bloom. Sophie spotted him from across the square. "Race you to the fountain," she shouted, her voice bright and daring. He jogged after her, pretending to be out of breath as she reached the marble steps ahead of him. Triumphant, she threw her hands in the air, and he laughed a deep, unguarded laugh he hadn't heard from himself in years. They sat together on the fountain's edge, tossing pennies into the water. Neither spoke their wishes, but Ethan knew his. He wished for time. More days, more afternoons, more moments like this. As they walked back toward the benches, Sophie tugged at his sleeve. "Your shoelace is untied," she announced with matter-of-fact seriousness. Before he could respond, she knelt, her small fingers looping and pulling the laces into a neat bow. She looked up at him with a mischievous smile. "Now I'm helping you, Dad." The word still caught him off guard. Not because it felt strange, but because it felt so natural. He swallowed hard, his voice softer than he intended. "You've been helping me all along, Sophie. My heart was the first thing you fixed." She tilted her head, considering his words, then grinned and hopped back on her bike. Her laughter carried across the cobblestones, weaving into the rhythm of the square. Ethan stayed still for a moment, watching her spin in circles, imprinting the sight in his memory. The day drifted toward evening. Street performers packed away their instruments, the scent of fresh bread wafted from a nearby bakery, and the square's lamps flickered to life. Ethan leaned against a lamppost, hands in his pockets, and let the moment wash over him. His thoughts drifted back to the day they met. Her torn dress, the cruel laughter of children, the way her name had stopped him cold. He remembered the ache of wondering what might have been. But now there was no might. There was only this second chances taken, walls broken down and a new life unfolding one quiet step at a time. Sophie circled back, her cheeks flushed from the cool air, and without a word, she slipped her small hand into his. It was such a simple gesture, but it pressed directly into his heart, more binding than any contract he had ever signed. Together, they walked toward Margaret's street, the fountain murmuring behind them, the cobblestones gleaming under lamplight. As Sophie chattered about a school project, something about building a cardboard castle big enough for her to sit inside, Ethan listened with his whole being, filing away every detail. He realized, not for the first time, that life's turning points rarely came wrapped in grandeur. They arrived quietly, a hand reaching for yours, a shoelace tied without being asked. And in those moments, everything changed. When they reached the little clapboard house, Sophie ran ahead to park her bike. Ethan lingered at the gate, watching her move with unguarded joy. He thought of all the years he had wasted chasing numbers, measuring worth in acquisitions and profit margins. None of it compared to this, to being here, being someone she could count on. Margaret looked up from her chair on the porch. Knitting needles paused in her hands. She gave him a look, steady and measuring, then nodded once. It wasn't elaborate, but it said more than words ever could. And in that quiet exchange, Ethan knew the truth. He was exactly where he was meant to be, and this time, he wasn't letting go. Life has a way of breaking us in the places we least expect. And sometimes it also has a way of stitching us back together in the most unexpected ways. Ethan Marshall believed he had everything of fortune, an empire, a name that commanded respect in every boardroom. Yet all of it was hollow, built on ambition and the illusion of control. What he did not have was what mattered most, the chance to love and be loved without conditions. It took a torn dress, a child's quiet courage, and a name that echoed from his past to bring him face to face with the truth. Sophie was more than a reminder of what he had lost. She was a second chance, a chance to heal, a chance to rewrite the story he once let ambition ruin. Through her, he discovered that redemption isn't found in success or possessions. It is found in the simple, everyday acts of love. Tying a shoelace, buying a pair of shoes in the rain, listening to laughter as it fills the air. Claire's absence left a scar that would never fully fade, but her greatest gift lived on in Sophia's gift that carried both the fragility of hope and the strength of resilience. And through Margaret's guarded watch, Ethan was tested not by contracts or deadlines, but by something far greater. The demand to stay, to show up, to be more than words. In Sophie's smile after her surgery, in her drawings filled with wild colors, in her small hand slipping into his, Ethan found a healing no fortune could ever buy. He came to understand that wealth is not measured in bank accounts, but in moments that cannot be priced, the kind that settle deep into the heart and stay there forever. This story is not only about a man finding his daughter, it is about the power of second chances, the courage to face the truth, and the healing that comes when we choose love over pride. It reminds us that no matter how far we have strayed, no matter what we have built on shaky ground, there is always a way back. And sometimes that way back is found in the quiet voice of a child calling you Dad. If this story touched your heart, let it be more than just a passing moment. Carry it with you. Remember that healing is possible, redemption is real, and love has the power to rebuild even the most broken places. And if you want to keep walking with us through stories of hope, loss, and healing, we invite you to subscribe to Loss and Healing. Together, we can continue to share journeys that remind us all of what truly matters. Not the wealth we accumulate, but the love we give and the lives we touch.